The Shepnaz podcast begins now.
You're listening to the Shepnaz podcast, a podcast by Shepherd Church. Everything we do here is to connect our community in a meaningful relationship with Christ, and we are expecting great things. My name is Joey. I get to be the host of this podcast, and today I'm joined once again by Pastor Rob Paul, the lead pastor of Shepherd Church, for us to talk more about the book of Ephesians. We are in our sermon series on Ephesians, and we're diving in to the middle of chapter 2, and this is going to be another two-parter, so stick around tomorrow to hear the next part of it. But until then, we're going to stick in the first couple of verses. So, Pastor Rob, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's an honor and a privilege.
That invitation gets delivered to you once a week to invite you onto this
And I don't
podcast.
take it for granted.
Yeah.
Because you run the show here. And so thank you for allowing me to be here.
That really couldn't be further from the truth. So we are slowly but surely making our way through the book of Ephesians.
Yes, plodding through.
The good news is there's only 6 chapters.
Yes. And the other good news is before you came, we did an entire series on chapter 6.
Yeah.
So we probably won't spend
A ton of time.
10 weeks in chapter 6 like we did before.
Yeah.
Probably.
There was
No promises.
When we did, I came to a church where they did a series in the book of Acts, and they went verse by verse the book of Acts. And have you done that before? I see the side-eyed.
Well,
Joe.
we started in the book of Acts, and I think we got through chapter 10 or 11, and we were on number 20 something, and we took a break and have not returned yet. Still need to finish that up. That's on my list.
Yeah, it took them almost 2 years.
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
And
it's the history of the church.
On the final Sunday, we did, and this is just dating all of us, but we did a David Letterman top 10 Sunday.
Yeah, that definitely dated you.
But we did a top 10, and then I, unbeknownst to my pastors, just because I was trying to poke at them a little bit, I got the Bible Project has a entire book of Acts in 7 minutes video, and
2 years, 7 minutes.
Right. It's the same thing. All right, we're gonna actually do something now. So I'm gonna read 2 verses, and then we're gonna talk about it.
Yeah. We're not gonna do this part up here in the beginning.
I don't know. Is that what you want to do first?
Yeah, I thought that would be way. Yeah.
We're gonna do this first because the actual reading the Bible wasn't in here. I don't see.
It's in there, just a little further down.
It's fine. But Rob's in charge, even though he said I was in charge.
I'm not in charge.
So, all right. So when we talk about your message this past Sunday, we talked about how we live in a world, and this is building. This was planned, I promise. Paul talks about sort of this rivalry that is happening in churches in this day, but it's not unlike what you and I and we all experience in everyday life. We talk about rivalries and polarizations all the time. We talk about political things. We talk about things that are less controversial, things like Coke or Pepsi. I'm glad to live, and one of the few reasons I'm glad I live back in the Midwest is that Pepsi products are more readily available.
And which Pepsi product would you be specifically talking about?
Well, if they would like to sponsor, we can talk about that. But,
it's green. Green can,
but we
bottled here in Ohio.
But we also have, Microsoft versus Apple, McDonald's, Burger King, Ohio State, and the team up north. Yeah. We've got all sorts of things that are polarizing and that. So, when we talk about some of that. Yeah.
So the reason that I think that we just kind of open with that is that we live in this world where everybody takes a side of something. No matter what it might be, like those things that you just mentioned. Yeah. But the Bible talks a lot about 2 different groups of people, especially in the New Testament, the Old Testament does as well. And it's important that we gain an understanding of those 2 different groups, because what Paul is going to do is make a massive shift in how the gospel is experienced. And so that's what we're talking about.
And so those 2 groups are the Jews and the Gentiles.
Right. Yep.
And there's a tension between them, and there are differences between them. Let's talk about those differences.
Yeah. And you probably, I'm sure you've read the Bible and you read about the Jews and the Gentiles. The Old Testament, a lot about the Jews, but in the New Testament, it starts talking a lot about the Gentiles, especially in the book of Acts. And if you've never really understood the differences, it's really important to understand, because what Jesus did on the cross he changed everything, literally. And so at the base understanding, Israel was chosen by God to be the recipients of his love and his blessings. Like, he chose the Israelites out of all the other nations. And as a result of God choosing the Israelites, he put in place systems to help the Jews encounter and experience and interact with God. And as you read through the Old Testament, there was no other nation, no other group of people on the planet that had those privileges. And so as the Jewish people have this system of connecting with God, and then the Gentiles did not. They didn't have these things. God didn't give them those laws and those things. And so I think understanding the differences between the Jews and the Gentiles is really important before we dive any further into chapter 2. And so if you take a look at it, like, you'll hear in the Old Testament, it'll talk about the Israelites, it'll talk about the Jews, or it'll talk about the Hebrews. That's all the same. So when the Bible is talking about the Hebrews or the Israelites or the Jewish people, that's all the same. And honestly, everybody else who's not a Jew are the Gentiles.
Right.
Like that, if you're not Jewish, you're a Gentile. Right. That's just the way the Bible does it. And the word Gentile literally means nation or nations. And so it's everybody else. And nations in the Bible really means a people group. And when it comes to the Jewish people, every single Jewish person can claim descendancy from Abraham. Like, and it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, where God said, Abraham, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And you said, look up in the stars and count. If you could count them, that's how many descendants you're going to have. And so everyone who is a Jewish person can claim some level of descendancy from Abraham. But the Gentiles is non-Abrahamic. So there's no connection to them. The only thing that they have in common is that they're not Jews. So like all Jews would say, well, what we have in common is that we're descendants of Abraham. Right. And of course, in that list is Jesus and David and all that. The non-Jewish people, no commonality whatsoever. And then the other thing is that when God made a promise to the nation of Israel that he was going to make a great nation out of them, he made a covenant with them, and he promised certain things. And he told Abraham that the mark of that covenant would be circumcision, which is not a fun thing to talk about on a podcast, but it was the mark of the covenant. Yep. And so, it was the way God said, if you're a part of this nation, then you have to be circumcised if you're a male. And so they would do that on the 8th day after a baby was born. It was a big deal, and it was the mark of the covenant. And so every time a male either would go to the bathroom, would be with his wife or whatever, it was there. It was this daily reminder, multiple times a day, even of the covenant that God had made with them, and all the Gentiles were not, right. So you hear about that, and then you even hear how they would be called uncircumcised or whatever, as if it was a bad thing. Not that it was necessarily a bad thing physically, but it was that they didn't have the covenant. They weren't marked in the covenant. So there's some of those differences, and then when it comes to religion, the Jewish people were monotheistic. They worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God had given them laws to follow to connect with him, and so they followed the laws. But the Gentiles were not. They could be monotheistic, which means just one God, but it wasn't necessarily the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? It wasn't that. But oftentimes the Gentiles were polytheistic. They would make their own gods. They would make their own idols or whatever. And there was no commonality. So every Jewish person had one God. There was even the saying that, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." There was one God. But for the Gentiles, there was many gods. So it could have had all of that kind of stuff. And then the other thing that's really interesting is that God gave the Israelites or the Jews or the Hebrews, whatever you want to call them, he gave them ways of connecting culturally with him. And so there were lots of religious festivals that they had, right? There were holy days and ceremonies and sacrifices. There was a temple that they could go to worship God and to offer their sacrifices. And it was a place for them to help connect with God. But culturally, the Gentiles didn't have that. And because they believed in lots of different gods, there's just no commonality at all. They worship their own gods. Sometimes they made their own gods. Sometimes their gods were made up. Sometimes they were demonic gods, whatever. And they just didn't have a means of connecting with God. And so you can see, like, if you're a Gentile, you're like, you really got the raw end of the deal, right? I mean, because the Jews got everything. God gave them everything. And part of that was just because he chose them.
Brand new event is coming to Shepherd Church this spring. Springfest happens on April 7th, and your family is sure to love it. There'll be tons of activities, from inflatable obstacle courses to a glow party, from a petting zoo to axe throwing. There's even going to be prizes for winners of games and tournaments that we have, like cornhole and can jam. Seriously, we can't wait to see you here for Springfest. You can learn more by visiting shepnaz.org/springfest. Make plans to come and spend the evening on April 7th with us at Shepherd Church. We want to get to know you. Each month, we've got an opportunity. If you're new around here, you're invited to Pizza with the Pastors at Massey's Pizza in Gahanna. The next one happens Monday, March 20th. You can RSVP by emailing Pastor Rob at rpaul@shepnaz.org. We're looking forward to seeing you and your family there.
So when you think about historically the difference between the Jews and the Gentiles, really the Old Testament is a history of how God lovingly interacted with the Jews, right? You go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, where God calls Abraham and says he's going to make this great nation. And from there on, most of the Old Testament is about God's interaction with Abraham's descendants, which are the Jewish people. And when you're looking at the Old Testament and Israel is conquering nations that God is giving them the land, is Gentile nations, because there are people who weren't Jews. So the Old Testament is about God's favor being with the Jewish people, and how the Gentiles did not have that favor. The lifestyles between Jews and Gentiles are really different. The Jewish people had strict rules governing how they should dress, covering their heads, not covering their heads. There was all kinds of stipulations regarding their diet, things that were clean, things that were not clean. And we read through the Old Testament. I'm reading through the Bible this year and just got out of Leviticus. Thank the Lord, I'm out of there. But now I'm in Numbers, and so it's kind of not as exciting either. But it's all the stuff you can eat. You can eat this, you can't eat that. Yep. And so there's all these rules, right? And then the lifestyles. But to the Gentile people, there was like,
do what you want.
Do what you want, right?
Yeah.
And so the Jewish people were living by these standards, and they looked at the Gentile people who had no standards, and like they're unclean. Yeah. They don't have the mark of the covenant. Right. They don't worship our God. They don't follow our rules. They're just like, they were just viewed by the Jewish people as outcasts,
right? In a prejudiced form.
Yeah. And there was this feeling that we're better because of God, and there was some favor, obviously, but what we're going to see is that God changed all that. And then just the last thing, we think politically, the way that the nations were ruled is that the Jewish people were ruled. It was a theocracy. It was God was the leader, but God would then lead through prophets and priests and kings, and God would select those leaders, and God used those leaders. But the Gentile nations were governed by themselves, and there was often godless leaders. Although Israel had godless leaders as well, but they were governed by people who appointed themselves. They didn't have any morality. What they did, what they didn't do, was governed by themselves, not God. And so there's a really, really big difference between the Jewish people and the Gentile nation. And it's really going to come to a head here in Ephesians chapter 2.
Yeah, and not to jump ahead, but the what happened was here and in other New Testament writings, because we see this with Peter and Paul in multiple writings, where it got to the point where the people of God, the Israelites, the Jewish people, sort of got a big head about this. Yeah. But it's because they didn't understand the fullness of the plan. The reason they were favored was so that the Messiah could come. Yeah. So that he could do what he's about to do, what we're about to read. Yeah. We're about to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that understanding the difference between Jews and Gentiles is so important, because in this second part of chapter 2, Paul is about to share how Jesus created a new way for people to encounter and experience and interact with God. And let me just say this, that you could read right through that and never catch what happened there. but it is seismic.
Yeah.
Like it is massive. It is life altering. It's colossal. It's gigantic. Like I'm trying to think of all the big. What's another word that makes
it's big?
It's huge.
It's big.
Like right buried in chapter 2, right in there, the end second part of that is something that literally changes everything. It's like history changing, life altering. And
right.
we want to make sure we get that, and to understand the difference between Jews and Gentiles helps us to get that.
Yeah.
So it's huge.
And so,
did I say it was huge yet? It is like massive.
And when you say that he made this massive, colossal, enormous, did you say enormous? Or
I don't know if I did, but that's a good word.
Gigantic shift in the gospel. Yeah. So what is he getting ready to say?
Well, that's a good question. And so let's build some suspense first, right? So here's what Paul does in verses 11 and 12 is that he goes back and he kind of repeats the same pattern that he used in Romans or in Ephesians chapter 1, where he talked about, or in chapter 2, where he talked about how without Christ we were in really bad shape, right? So remember, he says in chapter 2 there that without Christ we were dead in our sins. Because we were dead in our sins, we were disobedient. We were depraved. We were following our sinful nature. And we were doomed. And then really what Paul does here is that he also, in chapter 2, he reminds the Gentiles what they were before this massive shift happens. And we can cover that really fast. You want to cover that really fast? So here's what Paul says. The first thing he says is that, well, why don't you read that?
Yeah,
you read 11 and 12. Yeah,
we're going to read Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. This is what it says. It says, so then, remember that at one time you were Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcised by those called the circumcised, which is done in the flesh by human hands. At that time, you were without Christ, excluded from the citizenship of Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world.
Yeah. So one thing here that Paul talks about, he says that he talks about the circumcised and the uncircumcised, but he makes it really clear. He says that it was something done by human hands in the flesh, right? And so what he's saying is that it's a reminder. It doesn't save you,
right?
It's a reminder of the covenant that you had. It's the covenant that saves you, not that you were.
It's one of the things that we see in Scripture that the Israelites conflated to be the most important when it wasn't. It was a symbol, it was a sign of what it was, but it wasn't what happened. It wasn't what saved.
Right. It's,
the law could not save.
Yeah, it's like baptism. Baptism doesn't save a person. It's a symbol. A wedding ring is a symbol that you're married. Doesn't make you married. You can put a ring on it. Doesn't mean you're married, but it's a symbol that you're married. That was a symbol. It was a reminder of the covenant that God made. And so Paul's like, there's really not that much of a difference between the circumcised and uncircumcised.
As much as you think there was.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
and then he goes on and he says, so to those of you who are Gentiles, let me just remind you that you were living apart from Christ. Like the Gentiles didn't have the message that the Jewish people had about Jesus. Like Jesus literally came to the Jewish people first. And then when the Jewish people rejected him and crucified him, then the Gentiles were made open to the gospel. So they're living apart from Christ, and he says they were excluded from citizenship. So they weren't citizens of the nation of Israel, and because they weren't citizens, they didn't have access to everything that the Jewish people had. Now that stinks, because everything that they had was the stuff that would help you connect with God,
right?
Like all of that kind of stuff. And so, literally, I think that the word for aliens is xeno something, but it's where we get our word xenophobia, which is like just fear of the unknown,
outsiders,
outsider stuff. And literally, like the Jews were like, they just didn't want anything to do with them, but they were excluded. So you think about all the people that are coming into our nation today that are not. They don't have citizenship yet. They live here, but they can't do the things that citizens can do.
They don't have the benefit.
Right. And so that was the Gentiles. They were living. They could see the benefits that other people had, but they couldn't experience it at all.
Yeah.
And then he says they were excluded from the covenant promises. And so the promises that God had made to the nation of Israel didn't apply to them. And that's like that was, if you knew the the promises that God had made to the Jewish people, and you're like, oh, I want to be Jewish because those are great promises. There was nothing they could do. They weren't for them. And then literally Paul says, because of all these things, without Christ, excluded from citizenship and covenant promises, you're without hope and without God. So the Gentiles were literally like on the outside, excluded, outsiders looking in when it comes to God. And that's what Paul says. So in his first two verses, like, yeah, the Jews they're like it, but the Gentiles, they're not. And the Jews have everything, the Gentiles have nothing. And that's what Paul says in verse 2. Verse 11 and 12, first two verses. So that's where he is.
Yeah. And just like last week, we're going to leave you on quite the cliffhanger to maybe not so maybe not so encouraging verses, but they're
unless
important.
you're a Jew.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But they're
so if we have any Jewish
help.
friends, you were lucky, right? But Gentiles, they were not.
That help to build the case that Paul's going to argue is that everything changed.
Yeah.
When Jesus died
Seismic.
and rose again.
Seismic.
Yeah. So that's going to do it for our episode today. But I want you to stick around tomorrow, come back for part 2 of this episode so you can hear about what God does through Jesus' resurrection for not just Jewish people, but also for the Gentiles, which is good news for probably you and definitely me.
And me.
But thanks for listening. If you have anything that you'd love for us to hear, you can get a hold of us at podcast@shepnaz.org. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joey. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.